and I'm exhausted. I'm sorry, I can't help this. I have to tell you a grandchild story. Our Henry is 5. He'll be 6 in a couple of months. He's obsessed with maps. Loves maps. Wherever he can find a map, loves it. We play a game with Henry. And whoever we're with, we'll say, name a country. And the person will pick out a country. And then we'll say, Henry, what countries border that country? And he can tell you. Any country in the world. I can't come close to that. I thought I knew geography pretty well. My 5-year-old grandson blows me out of the water. It's amazing. He's a great kid. Great kid. Okay, on Sunday nights, we have been exploring some elements that I am bringing to us this summer because we need to have, number one, we need to have the assurance in ourselves that the things that we talk about are true, and we need to be able to share those things with other people as well. We live in a doubting world. More and more, the world doubts the validity of the Bible. They doubt God. They doubt Jesus. In all matters of faith, particularly Christian faith, the world is doubting. And so it is for us to be able to give a reason for the hope that is in us. And when we can point at some things that kind of give some proof evidence for the things that we talk about, it's encouraging to us. And occasionally we come upon a set of materials that are just kind of fun to look at. Now, I say fun because I think they're fun. Not everybody will, I suppose, but I hope everybody will find some value in this. Calling this tonight digging up evidence, because that's what we're trying to find. If in fact the things that we say, and tonight I'm particularly approaching things that we say about the Bible, if we say that that's truly from God, and that the things that are contained in the Bible are true and verifiable, then we should be able to offer some evidence for that. There are always people who will doubt. There are people that doubt that Matthew wrote Matthew, and Mark wrote Mark, and Luke wrote Luke, and on and on. There are a great many people who doubt most of the stories in the book of Genesis, and they call them simply fables, myths. Not really events, but they simply think they got handed down through time, not factual stories. There are a lot of people that doubt the way that our Bible's been put together. Instead of a book of Isaiah, they will say there's really a first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and third Isaiah, and they were probably written by different people at different times. And we can go on and on. There are all sorts of doubters about Scripture. So, if we are going to do some investigating, let's do some investigating where we're going and we're going to actually try to dig up some evidence. Some of you know that I got to go on an archaeological dig a number of years ago up in Perryton, Texas. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. But what we're focused on in any dig, we're looking for truth. We're not just trying to prove what we already think might have been. We're actually looking for truth. And in this particular dig that took place, it was in, this is not actually a picture of that dig, that is a picture of a dig. And it's called a dig because people actually go out and dig in the dirt. And they don't dig with shovels most of the time, they dig with brushes. And when you get down and you find some stone or some bone or something that might be a valuable artifact, then you get out your very delicate brushes and maybe a dental pick, and you dig with that so you won't damage the item. And it can be incredibly tedious work. But what happens when you dig down, you discover things. And you discover the truth of what was going on at that particular site. Well, in the case, I know there's not much there to see, but in this case, that arrow is pointing to this field, and on that site right there, there were some Native American dugouts. That is that the Indians would dig a hole, and then they would cover it on top of that, so that the home was actually half buried. And then in that, they would cover the bottom with some kind of a harder surface. And in that shelter, they would cook their food, and they would have shelter, and they could even go through the winter in these shelters. And it's an amazing sight. Well, that's what we were doing on this site. We were digging. And this particular site in Perryton, Texas, was occupied between 1250 and 1350 AD. And on this site, we found some seashells that probably came from Florida, and some others that probably came from the Gulf of California, because they were used as trading devices. And this was along a major trade route. Well, these are the kind of things that we discover when we dig down. This was along on this particular site. That right there is Wolf Creek. And as it turns out, there was a progression of settlements over a number of years. And we learned a lot about the Native Americans there. Well, if we're interested in that sort of thing, then how much more interesting is it when we get into things that we talk about that concern our Bible? So, let me show you a few of these things. We like confirmation about things that we've been told. We don't want it to be just word of mouth. We want to be verified. And so, the object of every dig, the object of our exploration, is always truth. We're not just trying to prove what we already believe. We're trying to prove what is honestly true. And sometimes we dig in the dirt. Actually, more often, archaeological digs are done in the library, where we look back at a lot of things. But occasionally we find some precious things that go along in this discovery. That stone is called the Moabite stone. It was found actually about 300 years ago, but it was found in what used to be Moab in the Bible. Today it is the modern country of Jordan. Now, what's significant about this is that stone comes from about 840 BC. Now, just to give you a picture here, David lived about 1000 BC. So within 150 years of David. And so we're getting back significantly in Bible history. On the Moabite stone, the word Yahweh was found, the Hebrew word for God. The writing on this stone actually tells about a conquest, a military conquest that was taking place. And the story seems to parallel the story that we read in 2 Kings chapter 3 in verses 4 through 8. So what we're finding here is an archaeological confirmation of specific scripture. There is a place on this tablet that it's been damaged. And so trying to figure out exactly what was said there is not as easy as it might be on the other parts. But they're thinking now that the phrase that they're looking at in one of the damaged places actually says, House of David. So we have a confirmation of a biblical event, and we have a confirmation of a biblical personality, a very well-known biblical personality in David himself, coming from 840 BC. Another one. We like to in the book of Genesis, there are several stories that the critics love to point out, oh, that can't possibly be right. And what's this story? Tower of Babel. Okay? Genesis 10 and 11, we get into the Tower of Babel. Actually, if we would go back and look at this, we find out this is simply an artist's rendition of what they thought the Tower of Babel might look like. Tower doesn't exist anymore. Interestingly, though, in that area of what is in the ancient area of Babylon, there were towers that were built that were called ziggurats, and they kind of stair-stepped up. We find a very similar design in other places. The Egyptian pyramids, if you look at them now, they are kind of stair-stepped up. They're actually, the Great Pyramid is made of about 2.5 million stones, and each of those stones weighed about 2 tons. So kind of a heavy structure there, okay? And it's stair-stepped up now. Actually, when the Great Pyramid was finished, it had also been smoothed over on all 4 sides with a material that filled in the steps so that you didn't step up on those. It was a smooth side on each thing. It must have been absolutely magnificent to look at. What's amazing for us when we look at the Egyptian pyramids is to understand that Abraham looked at those pyramids. Moses was very well acquainted with those pyramids because they have been around since about 2700 BC. Now, these designs also, if you look at the Mayan culture in the Americas, we see some similar towers. But what about the Tower of Babel? Did it actually ever really happen? As it is in our Bible, we have the tower being built, and people who evidently were somewhat arrogant and self-reliant, thinking that they were going to build this tower that would reach into heaven, and they had an attitude that they could do anything on their own. And because they were going in a direction that they were going, the story in the Bible tells us that God went down to confuse their language. And as the story unfolds, suddenly they were building, and then suddenly they were speaking different languages. And we use that to explain where the origin of a number of different cultures came from. Now you can imagine how the critics want to jump on this and say, what a silly fairy tale of a story. Except there was a stone, a clay tablet that was found in the region of what used to be Babylon that tells about a particular temple that was being built, and that the building of that temple, now this is in the words of the Babylonians, that temple so offended the gods that it was destroyed in one night, and the people were scattered with their speech made strange. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Now this comes from a Babylonian tablet. Now that it doesn't say God, it says gods, but understand, they're giving their side of the story. But we have, again, an archaeological confirmation of a biblical story. There's another event that took place, and I didn't have a picture that would go with this, but if I say Egyptian monotheism, here's the situation. We know that the Egyptians, before the time of Moses, worshipped many gods. Ra was their main god, god of the sun, but they had a number of other Egyptian gods that they worshipped. And they were really not too unlike the Roman gods or the Greek gods or the Babylonian gods or the gods of the Amorites and da-da-da-da-da. We can talk about all these different groups. Because at that time, we have used this word before, syncretism was the idea. It's okay for this place over here to have their gods, and this place over here has their gods, and everybody respected the idea that you didn't share gods, everybody had their own. And so it was a syncretistic system, all of these things going on at the same time. And the Egyptians certainly had their idea of their gods, and they were very dedicated to that. But then suddenly everything changed. When a pharaoh named Akhenaten came along, Akhenaten suddenly changed the records of the Egyptians. And no longer were they a polytheistic society. They suddenly became monotheistic. Under Akhenaten, they were not allowed to make images of the gods anymore. As a matter of fact, they respected the idea of one God so much that they would not make an image to him. Does that sound like something out of the Ten Commandments? They no longer practiced syncretism. It was completely banished. And the only thing that was allowed under the new Egyptian religion was that they would offer offerings on one altar. Now, why would they change so quickly? Well, it turns out that Akhenaten was the pharaoh that ruled from 1352 to 1336 BC. The earliest of those dates, 1352. We don't know the exact date of the Exodus. We don't know the exact date about when Moses went back into the country of Egypt under God's guidance as given in Exodus 3. We don't know the exact date of that. But the best that we can surmise, when Moses led the people out of Egypt, that happened somewhere between 1450 and 1350 BC. Now, what would cause a society as strong and as proud as the Egyptians to suddenly do such a dramatic change as to go from polytheism to monotheism? Perhaps it was because they had been persuaded by 10 plagues that were put upon that nation by the one God of the Israelites. And that God of the Israelites proved to be so dominant, so powerful, that they no longer saw polytheism as an option. There is obviously only one God. And the Egyptians started enforcing the idea of one God immediately after Moses took the people out of Egypt. And then we have what is a lot of people's favorite story, Noah's Ark. This is actually a picture of what is now a tourist attraction in Kentucky. You've seen it. Has anybody else here seen it yet? I have some other friends that have been there, and they stand in awe of this thing. Well, you can see. I mean, that's a sizable structure. This guy built this life-size model of the ark. Now, we're not sure that it is exactly that way, but I'm not sure that it's not either. But in careful research, this guy was responsible for building this ark. The question comes, was there really a flood? Because from the skeptical world, there are many who are rejecting the idea that there was a worldwide flood. Except, let's go to our libraries and let's start doing our research and see what the rest of the world says about a flood. We have a record of the flood in Genesis 5, 6, and 7. In the legends from Hawaii, there is a legend of a flood that covered the world. The Plains Native Americans in North America have a legend of a worldwide flood. You go up to the Hudson Bay in Canada, and in that area there is a legend of a worldwide flood. If you go to Peru, there is the story from their culture of a worldwide flood. Go to Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and there is a story that's been handed down through the ages of a worldwide flood. Go down to Tanzania, and there is the story of a worldwide flood. Go to Western Australia, and there is the story of a worldwide flood. And I understand that there is even a story from the South Sea Islands of a worldwide flood. And in China, there is the story of a worldwide flood. It's not just in Genesis 5, 6, and 7. It is a worldwide understanding that at one point there was a flood. Now, each of these cultures, in uninspired writing, add their own little details sometimes. And there's twists and twerks in the story. But the fact that there is a record of a worldwide flood all around the world has to lend some credibility to the story. Legends from China, I want to tell you about this. From ancient China, it describes a global catastrophic flood that was so vast that the waters reached, in the eyes of the Chinese, the waters reached the sun and covered the mountains, drowning out all the land-dwelling creatures, including mankind. In the midst of this global calamity, there stood one legendary hero. In the Chinese language, they call him Nuwa. And he survived the flood and was responsible for starting to repopulate the world. In the analysis of some archaeological findings in China, they seem to point back at the reality of this flood actually having been experienced by a number of people. In the Chinese language, the character for flood is actually the character of a boat with 8 people on it. Again, isn't that cool? Coming down as other evidence that this actually happened. And interestingly, that record in China was recorded around 1000 BC, making it, other than the Bible, makes it one of the oldest recordings of the flood on the earth. And so we have evidence that backs up the biblical story. And then I want to show you this. Was there actually a catastrophic event of the flood? Not just recorded in people's history, but do we have actual evidence that there was indeed a flood? Well, as it turns out, we have some evidence of some things that we don't quite understand. Because in the world, there are several things that have occurred that seem to point at the reality of a flood. Now, let me point out something. There are some things that people look at that I do not think are valid. Because people find seashells in the mountains of Colorado, I don't think that is fair to say that that is evidence of a worldwide flood that is Noah's flood. Because those seashells, though they are there, I've dug up seashells in Colorado, those are contained in a layer of sedimentary rock that's very thick. And a flood that would have covered the earth for about a year, less than a year as the waters subsided, would not have had time to lay down that thick a sedimentary level. And so understand that those seashells could be there for other reasons, geologic reasons, the pushing up of the land and such. But in the area of the Mediterranean Sea, now here we have this Mediterranean Sea here, okay? We have geologic evidence that at one point, because of plate tectonics and the big plates on the surface of the earth that move around, there was at one point, at this point right there, that is Gibraltar, that the European continent and the African continent pushed together and sealed off the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. And the evidence points to the fact that over a number of years, the Mediterranean Sea actually dried up. And the reason that we know that is we can do core samplings in the Mediterranean and we find desert plants at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And so the whole Mediterranean became a big desert basin. But then something happened, and the water levels in the ocean started to rise, and at Gibraltar the water broke through once again. And the water broke through with such a catastrophic event that it filled up the Mediterranean again. And that water went up through the Aegean Sea right there and through the Dardanelles Straits and into the Sea of Marmara right there, which, that's where I was baptized, okay? Into the Sea of Marmara, and then through the Bosphorus Straits up into the Black Sea. And we can do satellite imagery now, and we know that there was a shoreline at the Black Sea that is now 300 feet below the sea level of the Black Sea. And around that shoreline there is evidence of human settlement. So there were people living around there before this flood took place. And the flood displaced them and pushed them out. There is very strong evidence that some cultural things went in different directions from that. Now, the main evidence for this would point at a more regional flood than a worldwide flood. And therefore, I don't want to call this Noah's flood yet. I also know that there are a great many people that get all excited about there having been the discovery of Noah's Ark that would be way over here in the mountains of Ararat, and people claim that they found Noah's Ark and such. And there have been a number of books published and a lot of wonderful YouTube videos, and I hate to throw cold water on this, folks, but I don't believe them. Okay, I think the evidence is contrived. I would like to be proven wrong on that, but we don't need to just swallow every piece of information that comes along and say that it's true just because we want to believe it. I don't think we really have the evidence that they found Noah's Ark yet. But we do know that there was a catastrophic flood. We do know that the worldwide evidence was that there was a worldwide flood. We do know that even in China, the evidence was that there was a man and a total of 8 people on a big boat that survived that flood and repopulated the earth. Confirmation from other sources of the stories in the Bible. Now, I think that we could go on and we could talk about a number of things. I'm gonna stop at this because there's a number of things that, I don't know, I may want to save till another time. But the whole idea here is this: our Bible is reliable. And when it tells a story, we may not be able to grasp the wholeness of that story. There's a lot of things about Noah's flood that I don't quite understand. But you know what? That there was a flood and that Noah was the head of the family that survived that flood, I think we have powerful confirmation of that, starting with our Bible and then being confirmed from other sources. There are a lot of amazing stories in the Bible, and there are the skeptics that want to say, oh, that can't be true. But the more we learn, oh yes, it not only can be true, it is true. And we get all this simply because we take time to go dig for the evidence. Don't ever be afraid of the sciences that explore these things, because all we're doing is looking for truth. And when we dig in, we find that God has provided us with some wonderful evidence that we can take and we can hand to our skeptical friends and say, look at this. Some of these things I think a skeptic would have a hard time refuting. Now, skeptics are going to argue because skeptics argue. But when we get down to it, truth is available. Thy word is truth, the scripture says. We don't need to be afraid to explore or to ask questions or to investigate. We don't need to be afraid of any of these things, because the bottom line is the only truth that exists is God's truth. And he has revealed his truth in the Bible. We can trust the Bible for all that it says. I hope this is fun. Hope this is helpful. Hope this is reassuring to you and perhaps useful in your conversations with others as well. We've had a very good day. We've had ups and downs as a family today. And yet here we are as family. And we are here for one another, and we're grateful for that. If we can be of any help to you in your spiritual life, come right now. Let's stand and sing.
He is able, more than able, to accomplish what concerns me today. He is able, more than able, to handle anything that comes my way.